All right. So we're going to focus on the fact that Matthew is written to introduce, offer, and prepare the Jews for the kingdom of heaven. And specifically in Matthew chapter 18, we're dealing with Matthew preparing the remnant of Israel to survive the time of Jacob's trouble. If you can get your mind wrapped around those two things and keep that as the backdrop, Matthew becomes very easy. Matthew 18 has a lot of difficult statements within it. But if you keep the kingdom in its focus, because that's the question that's presented, we can go ahead and deal with this passage very simply. In Matthew 18:1, they ask a question, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? They knew the question was shameful. How do I know that they knew that the question was shameful? Because it says so. And remember in Mark chapter 9, they were going to Capernaum, and when they were in the house, he began to question them. What were you discussing along the way? But they kept silent, for they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. I wouldn't want to answer the question either, right? So Matthew records it as a question where Jesus draws out the question in Mark. Both are appropriate. And sitting down, he called the 12 to them. If anyone wants to be first, he shall be last and servant of all. The point has been discussed previously about how to be great in the kingdom of heaven. That point has been discussed. It's nothing new to them. In fact, probably one of the reasons they're questioning, who's the greatest. In Matthew 5:19, we saw that in order to be great, you are to keep and teach the commandments. Now, again, this is under the administration of Israel, under the economy of the law. It was true back then. It's not how we're great in the kingdom, so to speak, now. And it will be true again during the time of Jacob's trouble, heading into that time frame. I was talking with somebody about the time frame of Jacob's trouble after the rapture. And one big misconception is that as soon as the rapture occurs, the time of Jacob's trouble begins. That's not what starts off that time. It starts when they sign the treaty with the beast. So how much time between the rapture and the beginning of the Great Tribulation will there be? I don't know. Is it days? Is it weeks? Is it years? But all that time is leading up to a kind of the Israel is once again the administration, and the economy is law. Otherwise, God is not going to judge the earth and bring down his judgments, his wrath, because grace is the economy, then he will not judge. But if law is the economy, then he will judge, because he can hold the world accountable according to his law. Matthew chapter 11, verse 11 also talks about being great and least in the kingdom of heaven. So they have this kind of teaching already. And so you have the disciples starting to make distances. Peter, James, and John are with Jesus, and the other 9 are down there doing menial tasks. And of course, questions come out. Who is the greatest? I can imagine Peter being, it's me, obviously. I'm going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And so they're discussing this and arguing amongst themselves. Now, before I said that this is not an improper question, and I've changed my mind. Week to week, look at that. After reading Matthew 18 again, giving it more thought, I think this was a shameful question. I think that it wasn't just shameful because they thought it was shameful. I think that Jesus is actually giving them a solid rebuttal in his response to the question or their discussion of who is the greatest. You'll see why in just a moment. The word for greatest is not a question about who's the tippy top, because obviously we know who's the greatest in the kingdom. And even after Jesus, we still have David and Moses, various different individuals who I doubt they would say were great among those people. However, there is a tier system we find within the kingdom of heaven. And so they're curious as to where they rank, who has greater authority, who has lesser authority in the kingdom of heaven, a hierarchy, so to speak. And they were curious as to where their placement is, but their curiosity led, I believe, to arrogance in their arguments. So the disciples have supposedly done what Jesus has told them so far about being great in the kingdom of heaven, and they were curious as to how they would be evaluated. It's a question of order of rank. who has higher authority and who has lesser authority. In Matthew chapter 18, 2 through 35, Jesus responds. We talked about this last week. He responds with three main lesson points. The first one is humility. Now, humility actually goes all the way from 1 through verse 14, because humility is not simply about how you view yourself, but also how you deal with the humble. So if you are like, oh, the humble are down there and they're kind of just, kind of like how pharmacies used to be. Today pharmacies are on the same level. How did pharmacies are always like 2 or 3 feet higher than everyone else with this huge superiority complex. And even now, do you remember when we first started this, where I used to try to teach from? Why? I don't like this. I don't like being above. It always felt like I'm not. This is not where I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be down there. But a few people said I can't see you, so I'm like, okay, I'll come back up here. It's not what I liked, but it is what it is. Of course, it's not in the actual position. It's in the mental attitude, and that's very important to maintain. So humility, accountability. Accountability is 15 through 20. And it's basically how do you going to function amongst yourselves? And notice he doesn't give Peter saying, Peter, keep those disciples in line. He says, if anybody is in error, you're going to go ahead and go through this process. And we'll talk about it, how that applies to the disciples, and it's not part of the church. And number 3 is forgiveness. It's 21 through 35. And again, when we get there, there's some issues we need to iron out, because there's a lot of different misconceptions in dealing with what this means, in particular the parable. Tonight we're going to go through 1 through 14, if I can get through it all. If I can't, then I'll just finish it up next week. It's not that big of a deal, but I would like to try to get through this in basically 3 lessons, try to get through verse 18. Let's give it a read, and we'll pick it up with some observations. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And he called a child to himself, and he set him before them and said, truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. But woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be cast into the eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be cast into fiery hell. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them have gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountain and go search for the one who is straying? If it turns out that he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over more than over the 99 which have gone astray. So it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones perish. Once again, if you take this passage and break it up and deal with verse 5, and then deal with verse 4, and then go down and deal with verse 10, or verse 8 and 9 by itself, or verse 14 by itself, you're going to have a hodgepodge of different doctrines and theologies, and you're going to be very confused. But if you read it all in context, and specifically the context of the book of Matthew, again, this becomes easy. Reading it independently, you go, what do I do with this? Because we know salvation, avoiding hell, is a free gift. You don't have it. Gabby, sorry, it's over here. I didn't know if you're coming. You can come in if you want to. She's there looking through paperwork. Where is this? What?
It sounded like you were talking about eternal life.
I know. Gabby doesn't have it either. It's Gabby, your eternal life's over here, and you don't have it. Yeah, sure. You could. I'll appreciate that. Thanks. And I'll be honest with you. If you pick up the book of Matthew, turn to chapter 18 in a vacuum, you're going to have trouble with theology. Flat out. If you understand Matthew, this is easy. But before we start getting into the nitty-gritty about some of these phrases, let's make some additional observations, which I think are kind of interesting. Now, first and foremost, what is the main point of this text? Let's get rid of the peripheral. Let's get rid of all the kind of the scary stuff and just deal with what it's talking about. It's dealing with humility, dealing with being humble. That's the point. So first and foremost, if you start there, what's the main point of that? Then again, this passage doesn't become so scary. But let's deal with another observation. Where did Jesus get a child? Interesting, right? Now, again, if we go back to Mark, which we read already, he's in a house. They've gotten to Capernaum. He's in a house. Whose house? Well, that's Jesus' hometown. Perhaps it was Jesus' family's home. Some people think it was Peter's home. Peter he might have had a house in Capernaum, but I think he was from Bethsaida. So who knows? It could have been just a benefactor's house. So I find this very interesting because, number one, he has a child there. And Jesus is challenging the disciples with an audience. I found that odd. Normally, when he's talking to disciples about discipleship things that he's dealing with, normally he's talking to them in private. Here, he's in a house, and he calls them out. He didn't question them while they're on their way. He waits for them to have an audience and then begins to question them about what they're talking about. To which I really think this is kind of like one of the harshest statements that Jesus makes to the disciples in their history. The word little ones, which is used 3 times in what we just read, is not children. It's mikros. Now, mikros is a word that we know. We talked about this back in Matthew chapter 10, verses 40 through 42, where it's not talking about children. It's talking about the least of the disciples or the least people in Israel. So it appears as though that there is a double entendre. He uses a child as the least of the least, but then refers to the least of these in reference to a greater population other than children. The reason I bring this up is because when you deal with words like little one, you always think as the little ones that we have running around. Those are the little ones. However, that's not how the word is used typically in the New Testament. So the word little ones here is not simply about children. It's about the least amongst the people in Israel. In fact, even Matthew chapter 11, verse 11, where we read before, dealing with the least in the kingdom of heaven is the same word, mikros. So once again, we're not talking about necessarily children, although I think children is the ultimate representation of the mikros. Mikros is used in Matthew 18:6, 18:10, 18:14, and I've already kind of spoiled the answer to the question. This is not talking about the humility of children. It's talking about a greater population of the humble. And I would say if you want to define mikros in this context, it's those who are humble, lowly, disadvantaged, low in rank, not prominent in status or economics. And there's plenty of passages which kind of back that up because the Jews were very, especially within Israel, were very much geared towards impressing those who were rich. James talks about it. Paul talks about it. In Acts 15, remember the poor, because the poor were truly poor. It's not like the poor in America, which are rich, but the poor in Israel were truly destitute, without food, without clothing. So very interesting initial observations, but now let's get to some of the difficulties within the Matthew chapter 18. Let's understand this within the context of Matthew, the context of the kingdom, and the context of the fact that we're not talking about how to go to heaven. Okay? You got to start asking those questions right away. First and foremost, 18:3. Unless you become rice and become like children, that's the only thing, it's an old joke from Eric, right? That the only thing I know that's converted is rice. So like, what's converted mean? And it's a bad translation, because the word for converted deals with a concept of, I think I skipped ahead a little bit too much. Oh yeah, I did. It basically means to turn or to change. Converted sounds like you're changing religions, right? So we need to figure out a better way to say that. Now, first and foremost, he's talking to the disciples. He's responding to their question about who is the greatest in the kingdom. And then he throws out this idea that you will not enter the kingdom of heaven if you don't change. To which we all go, what is going on? Entering the kingdom of heaven is not about the spiritual, but the physical kingdom. The problem we think about is, are we going to enter the kingdom? Yes. How? In the resurrection, in a spiritual body, not a spiritual physical body, a resurrected body, not as our life right now. We're not even going to have that opportunity. And so when we look at that type of phrase, we automatically think the person is not reconciled to God because he was not humble. Now, in order to kind of get around this, the typical Bible church answer, because of which I've been part of for a while, and I have many friends who do this, they take Matthew 18 and say, humility is likened to believing in Jesus. So are you trying to tell me that the disciples weren't already believers in Jesus by this point? That conversion was necessary for the disciples? That, you know what? You think you're going to be great, but you're not even saved yet. Or maybe he was talking to them, but referring to some of the people else in the room. Or maybe he's just starting over with them a little bit. And it does not make sense, because you still have to get through what's going on with the thrown into hellfire. And he's still warning the disciples. Entering the kingdom is an earthly concept. There was a chance, based upon this text, and I know this is going to be a little controversial for a lot of people, there was a chance that these disciples, if they did not change and become humble, that if the kingdom were to come during their lifetime, that they would not make it in. And people go, what? Let me ask you a question. If Moses was around during the time of Jesus, would he, and the kingdom came about, would he have made it in? Moses was leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, through the desert, 40 years, and then into the promised land. What's the problem? He did not make it into the promised land. And so we have to make sure we remember Moses in regards to this idea of entering the kingdom. Because obviously Moses will be there, but he didn't make it into the promised land as part of a punishment from God because of his disobedience. So yes, I do believe that if the disciples were to be alive at the time of the kingdom inauguration, and they did not change their attitude and become humble, that it's possible that Jesus says, you're not coming in as a human. What happens to them at that point? I don't know. They die physically, I believe that. But what happens to their spiritual selves? Are they held? Do they just pop back up again and resurrected body? I don't know. It doesn't address it. That question was, that question was actually posed to me like that. So you're telling me that a person in the kingdom who believes in Jesus dies. Do they just pop back up again? Your guess? I don't know. I don't know how that works. We'll find out. Do you understand, though, that you can liken entering the kingdom of heaven, likening it to entering the promised land? That's how we have to think about this. Otherwise, we get some bad theology. So, the first thing the disciples had to do was to secure their entry. Now, we know that the kingdom will not come, but that was not known to the disciples at that time. So even though it's talking to the disciples about entering the kingdom of heaven, and even though Jesus probably knows by this point it's not coming now, even in his humanity, this will become applicable again at the end times, leading into the time of Jacob's trouble and within the Great Tribulation. This is why it's emphasized that this is gearing people or gearing the remnant to prepare themselves for the time of Jacob's trouble, because not all believers will make it through, and not all Israeli believers will make it through. If you have an Israeli believer at the time of the abomination of desolation, and they don't leave Israel, what will happen to them? They will probably die under the judgments. Okay? That's where you have to keep your mind. In this response, Jesus rebuts their question about who's the greatest with a warning about entering the kingdom. And he tells them they need to be converted. That is the word strepho, to turn about or to change. Their mental attitude was wrong, and it was set upon their greatness, their rank, and their position. They're all set. Again, what are they thinking? Jesus is here. He's talking about dying, but we don't know what that means. And we're anticipating, we just saw the Mount Transfiguration, which means the kingdom is coming. That's what they're understanding. And they're anticipating the coming kingdom to happen at any moment. That's what they're waiting for. And they're just concerned about, getting prepared to rule. That's where their mind is. So in their discussion and argument, I believe that they were being haughty, arrogant, and conceited based upon Jesus' response. So therefore, Jesus is telling them that with that attitude, they're not getting in. They're not getting in with that attitude. They had to become like children. And once again, we have a verse that explains becoming like children in the next verse. But even with this has been taken very strangely, I think. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Humble like this child. And here is normally where the commentaries go. What are the characteristics of a child? If you were to characterize a 3-year-old, right now we have a good example of that, right? Now, it doesn't mean, so we be throwing fits every time we're not told we can't have candy? No, of course not. But how is a child supposed to function? And we're like, okay, I can understand. I need to become like a child, which means what? Unassuming, right? That I'm supposed to be very trusting. That I'm supposed to be. That I follow instructions without question. You could get a child who trusts you to do almost anything, even if they're scared. That you must believe in Jesus with childlike faith. Have you ever heard this before? I hope so. I don't think I'm the only one. Have you ever seen the phrase childlike faith in the Bible? There's a song by Jars of Clay, and I have to skip it every single time. It's a Christian group, and it's basically with faith like a child. And it's supposed to be free and kind of like just this wispy faith. And I don't understand it. This phrase right here, I don't think I could be more offended by that phrase. Because it's not in Scripture. Normally, when you talk about a childlike faith like a child, it means you believe whatever is put in front of you without question, and it's not admirable. What is it? It's naive. To just go ahead and say, oh, I believe that. And normally when we have a child, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, and you start talking about Jesus, they'll believe anything you say. Hey, Jesus writes on a cookie on the, out in the, oh yeah, that's fantastic. They'll believe you, right? How do I know that? Because our daughters were devastated when they found out that mermaids weren't real. They were convinced that and they believe you because you're very convincing. You know how to twist their little minds. But is that what it says? Read it. Where does it say believe like a child? Where does it say trust like a child? Where does it say, just blindly grab my hand and leap into me? Does it say believe in me like a child? Does it say that? Does it say that anywhere? It does not. What does it say is like a child? Anyone? What does it say? Humble like a child. That's it. The disciples were to be humble like a child. Humility is the only thing that is being discussed in this context. There is no trusting like a child, believing like a child, obeying like a child. Humble like a child. That is what the reference is about. And that is the connection that Jesus is making between the arrogance of the disciples and the humility of a child. What does humility mean? We talked about this in 3 other passages in Matthew. So I'm not going to go over all the Greek here. Humility means understanding your place and your role and not placing yourself in a station that is not yours. My favorite lesson on humility is dealing with the parable on the feast. Remember this one? Where Jesus says, if you go to a feast, don't place yourself at the head of the table next to the master of the house. Because someone else is more important is going to come in and you're going to have to go, hey, you need to go down a few steps. Rather, set yourself at the foot of the table and be called forward. For he who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Even if you don't go all the way to the front, if you place yourself at the foot of the table, remember, because they set people in priority over who's the honored guests, and you get called to the middle of the pack. You're like, hey, it's a lot better than the foot. That's humility to my mind. That's the perfect example of that. Don't think of yourself as being better than who you're with. A child is the ultimate example of every single adult in the room will look at a child and go, I'm at least better than he is. He's a baby. They don't know anything. They're immature. And yet they're supposed to humble themselves like that child. And a child looks at every single person in the room with what? You know more. You're bigger. You're stronger. How do I know that? Anybody could be standing right here. And if Caleb wants to open that door, do you think he'll go, you can't help me? No, you can help me. Every adult in the room is great in the eyes of a child. A child does not naturally place themselves as the most important person in the room, even though they throw tantrums. You understand that? But they look at other adults and they understand that they're bigger, they're stronger, they're greater than they are. A child does not exalt themselves to position. That's the humility of a child. In 18:5, it turns a little bit now. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Now it's not just humble yourself like a child is humble. Now you need to receive a child. And this is where it becomes this this double entendre, that he's not just talking about a child. He's using a child as an example of the most humble ones in the room. The word to receive is the word dekamai. Dekamai means to be receptive, to accept, or to care for. The disciples were not only to be humble, but they were to receive the humble. They were not only to be humble, they were to take care of the humble, the lowly, the disadvantaged, the ones who don't have a lot or are not as capable as they are. In verse 6, another warning. But whoever causes one of these little ones, here again, you see the transition, child, receiving the child, causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. And remember, to stumble doesn't mean to trip, although that's the visual we get. It means cause them to fall or cause them to sin. The word is scandalizo, and it means to scandalize them. Basically, I would picture this. What does the word scandalizo mean in this context? Think of the Pharisees with the lowly and the humble in Israel. What did they do to them? Think of the Pharisees. Think of the Sadducees, the leadership in Israel. Were they kind and helpful and trying to lead them and feed them? No, they oppressed them and taxed them and wanted everything from them. They believed that the people were there to serve them rather than in leadership in Israel to serve the people. That was a scandal. They scandalized them. You can put that into past tense. In Matthew chapter 10, the disciples were now, under Jesus' leadership, the de facto leaders, spiritual leaders of Israel. They were replacing the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the lawyers. They were the ones who were leading the people. That's what they're being trained for. That's what the discipleship program in Matthew 10 is all about, is that they were to be the new leaders of Israel. And as the new leaders of Israel, they were to then receive the little ones, to receive the humble, so that they would teach them and help them rather than use them like the previous leadership. The Pharisees and the scribes oppressed the humble and victimized them for power and prosperity. The disciples were to humble themselves as Jesus is humble, and to be self-sacrificial as Jesus was in leading the humble ones. Then you have a warning in verse 6, right? This warning in verse 6 was an expression of extreme terror. I mean, I don't think there's any worse way to die, right? Tie a millstone, a big heavy stone around your neck, and just jump into the sea and have this weigh you down. No chance of surviving that. And why is it better that you have that if you cause one of those little ones to stumble, why is it better that you have a millstone around your neck and cast into the sea? Why? Let me ask you a question. What is it better to happen to you? To be thrown into the sea with a millstone around your neck, or face the judgment of Jesus when he sits in his judgment? What would be better? Would you want to face Jesus in his glory if you know that it's not going to be a pleasant experience? Or would you rather be cast into the sea? That's the expression, and that's why it's stated like that. Stumbling blocks continue, though. In verses 7 through 9, you have these woes, right? Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. But woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes. And then, again, you read this, and if you don't understand the stumbling part, if you don't understand what's happening here, if you don't understand the kingdom reference, this becomes confusing. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off, throw it from you. It's better to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and to be cast into eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be cast into the fiery hell. And almost for my entire youth, when this was explained, it was hyperbole. It was hyperbole. It's just basically take extreme caution, as if you could be thrown into hell, but you won't be. So therefore, the extreme caution is still one that is necessary, even though these things can't happen to you as a believer. Do you think Jesus is pulling punches? Do you think Jesus is speaking in hyperbole here? The world does cause the humble, believing Jew to stumble, and that's the main point here. The humble ones is dealing with the nation of Israel. The context is the kingdom of heaven. And the goal is to enter in and to be great. What is the negative? To not make it in and to be judged. These verses serve as a warning that the disciples must be willing to take the extreme self-sacrificial measures, not to stumble, be caused to sin, and likewise, as leadership, cause the little ones, the humble ones, to sin, or else they risk losing their rank, maybe, or even not making it in. So with these extreme measures, not to make it in, what is it possible that happens? Well, number one, during the time of Jacob's trouble, if you're not doing what's right, it is very possible that you don't survive the day to even get judged. But if you do make it to the end, because remember, it's cut short so that all flesh will not die, there will be those who will make it to the end who will be judged. And there will be those who make it to the end who get to go in. Those who do not make it in get thrown into the eternal fire. Now, eternal fire is explained in the next verse, and in Greek, it is literally the fire of Gehenna. Do you remember talking about Gehenna before? Gehenna is not found in the Septuagint. Gehenna is not a word that means hell or Hades or the eternal pit. Gehenna was a trash dump. They knew where Gehenna was. Now, unlike us, they were not environmentally friendly. They burned their trash. Not only did they burn their trash, they burned corpses who could not afford a burial plot. If you were a lowly, a leper, sickly, humble, they would take your body and throw you into Gehenna. Literally. The fire was so intense, and there was so much trash, obviously, that for years the fire didn't go out. It's not like they would go out there and have to start the fire again. It was a constant burning pit. I don't understand it. I haven't seen it. This is what the history books tell us. So they called it the eternal fire because it doesn't go out. Do we have anything in reference to that? Do we have an eternal flame that sometimes we light? Olympics? They refer to it as an eternal fire, eternal flame, although they do put it out. So the eternal fire is not talking about the spiritual hell where the damned go. This is talking about the physical pit. And if you're there when Jesus comes to judge, he will destroy you if you are not getting in. And they liken that to being thrown into the fires of Gehenna. So do not confuse this language with Hades or hell, the spiritual place of torment. This was a physical destruction. So if you are wanting to get into the physical kingdom, but for some reason your hand or your eye or your foot is going to cause you not to go in, it's better to cut off your hand. than to get judged. Obviously, once again, kind of a symbolism or a metaphor to say take extreme measures to make sure that you're prepared when Jesus comes in that judgment form at the end of the Great Tribulation. And how do I know all that? Because verse 10 is the instruction. He tells them to humble themselves early on, and then goes through all of this kind of fiery, prophet-like, judgment-like language you'll find in Joel, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Isaiah. And then he tells them specifically, in verse 10, see to it that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven. Jesus takes the discussion to full circle. The disciples' responsibility as leaders was not to reject, cause to stumble, or despise one of the humble ones who believe in Jesus. Despise is the word kataphroneo. The word means to look down upon, or to think poorly about. So you have these micron, these humble ones, low in status, low in economics or social political status, ones that are humble and in need for protection or looking after, and you are not to scorn or treat them with contempt. That was the lesson for the disciples. The lesson is about humility. To emphasize the importance of the humble believer, Jesus then talks about their angel. And Hebrews chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, are they not all ministering spirits sent by the Father to help in time of need? We don't see this. We haven't experienced it. We all talk about, having an angel on our shoulder. It's not what it is, or not our conscience. I don't know in what way. I don't know how. But it's a reality that angels are ministering spirits here to help out individuals in time of need. And it says that their angel is basically going back and forth between God and them. So if God views the humblest of them, the most humble of them, if God views them as that important to have an angel look after them in time of need, how should the disciples look after them? Now, verse 11, I'm not sure if you have a note on verse 11. It says that Jesus, for the Son of Man, has come to save that which is lost. That's not in the original text. It was probably a note by a scribe who was copying down the book of Matthew, remembering passages in Luke, specifically Luke chapter 19, and just going, man, this is in the similar vein. And when people put things in the margin, sometimes other copyists thinks, oh, that was added, and they'll kind of slip it in, and it becomes part of the text by accident. So it's not there. However, it's true, and it kind of fits the context, but it's not originally in the text. And then it ends with verses 12 through 14, the parable of the 100 sheep. If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountain and go search for the one who is straying? If it turns out that he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over more than the other 99 which have not gone astray. So it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of the little ones perish. What's the point? The disciples are in charge of 100 people, 100 humble ones. That's their responsibility. And one goes astray. Oh, well, no. You are to, go and search, find them. Now, a lot of people try to take that to church responsibility. We have a different culture. We're not Israel. right? However, I'll be honest with you, if I know that somebody who is a believer who has been under my care is struggling, not just go to a different church, right? Because I can't control that. Then yes, we try to help, challenge, we teach, redirect. The disciples were being trained to not be like the Pharisees. The point of Matthew is a lesson for the disciples, understanding that each individual believer, each individual humble Jewish believer in Israel is valuable to God and therefore valuable to them. Again, I mean, we went through this rather quickly, but I hope that you see that the passage is easy to understand as long as you keep it within the context in concept of the physical kingdom and concepts of humility. The passage is not about a person's position before God. All the disciples are believer in Jesus, except for Judas. This is about the disciples' responsibility, and Jesus is addressing the arrogance of the disciples. He tells them, do not look down upon those in your keep. So are you going to be arrogant and think it's about you and think about how you're going to be great? Or are you going to think about those who are in your charge? The disciples first need to understand that they need to be humble. They need to understand their place. They need to understand their responsibility. They need to be self-sacrificial in order to be able to, number one, enter the kingdom of heaven if it was to come at their time. And as the chosen leadership of Israel, they are to lead the remnant. This is part of the point. It is the opposite of what the current leadership was doing. Matthew 23, 11 through 13, we've read this several times. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. He's approaching, once again, humility. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled. Whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people. For you do not enter in yourselves, nor are you allowing those who are entering to go in. They're roadblocks. They're stumbling blocks. Woe to them. It's better for them to have a millstone tied around their neck and to be cast in the sea than to face the judgment that would have come if the kingdom were to happen at that time. But how does he address the disciples? In Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 to 27, Jesus called them to himself and said, you know, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first amongst you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Humility of the leader and accepting of the humble is a common theme in the epistles as well. We know that this is the overall main thrust of leadership. In James, taken on, that's Jesus' half-brother, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay attention to the one who is wearing fine clothes, and you say, you sit here in a good place, and you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down by my footstool, you have made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives. Listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? Peter also talks about this. In 1 Peter chapter 5, I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God amongst yourselves, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but providing to be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the unfading crown of glory. It's a crown, a level of authority within the kingdom. But to get there, it's servant leadership. So the primary application to the time during that time was to the disciples, to be humble and to receive the humble, not like the Pharisees who treat the poor with disrespect, thinking themselves to be something that they're not. Primary application to our time, this is about leadership. The leadership need to be humble. Leadership need to understand their place and position and not treat anybody with disrespect, regardless of their presentation, their economics, or how they even just carry themselves. A further understanding, a eternal attitude, is the fact that humility is a well-known virtue. We all want to be humble. How do we do that? First and foremost is understand our position under Christ. But you have to be very careful with the warnings in Matthew. The warnings in Matthew are under a system of law. That's the economy. B, it's under the administration of Israel. But should we be humble? Of course. To conclude, Matthew 2, 5 through 8. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Let's pray. And God, we thank you that we have the writings of Matthew 18, and obviously we historically has been misunderstood and misused. We thank you that we have the entire context. We know the words that are contained within, and we can see within the context that the lesson is humility, and for the leadership of the disciples to take on the humble. Help us to understand the proper place of that content, especially the warnings, and understand that we're saved by grace through faith, and that there are no consequences. There's no, let me say that wrong, right. There are no punishments for those who are in Christ Jesus. We're not under the threat of not making it into the kingdom, because we will make it in as glorified saints because of us being in you. But God, we also thank you that you are a just God, and you handle your disciples with both care and careful instruction. You lead them appropriately, and we also know that this would be very powerful for those who will be here during the Great Tribulation and leading into the kingdom. Thank you for our understanding. Help us to understand who you are better. We thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.